Hey, it's Mo. Let's go. Bike selection. This topic has been on my mind for quite some time since I started selling motorcycles. Four really cool brands, by the way. And I've been reflecting on how many choices there are today compared to when I started riding. When I started riding, there were naked bikes and a few modified with the high pipe as scramblers. Essentially, there were two types of motorcycles back in the 60s and 70s: naked bikes and Harley Davidsons, which we call touring bikes. Think Road King, that style. Into the 70s, Vetter started making fairings. And at the same time, around that time, the Easy Rider movie came out. So there were two main customization themes: choppers, where we would just add extended tubes. 6-inch shoulder were very, very common. You saw many Honda CV750 four cylinders with 6-inch extended, and they put the Z bars on there, and then you had some windshields and some headlights and some custom paint. But the main thing were those 6-inch overs. You also had the other more customized choppers with the hardtail and the raked out front doing some welding and cutting. But there were a lot of 6-inch overs. The other main thing we had were touring bikes. So you saw Honda 750s and then later the Kawasaki Z1 with the big Vetter fairing. And people would buy the bike and buy the fairing and have the shop install it because it was pretty complicated. Fast forward into the 80s, and by then you had the major manufacturers providing their own bikes. I remember the Yamaha Venture. In fact, the Goldwing, when it first came out, was a naked bike, had no fairing. Later on, the Goldwing had the fairing. I think the first one was called the Aspencade. So what's my point? Riders were customizing bikes to personalize them, and manufacturers responded by creating motorcycles that matched what the riders were customizing. Now, in the 2020 timeframe, we have so many different bikes because of those customizations. We have bobbers, we have roadsters, we have the vintage bikes, we have the naked bikes, we have the retro bikes, we have the sport bikes, we have the cafe racers. You can buy them all like this. These bikes were customized in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You have the cruisers, you have large touring bikes, smaller touring bikes, super large cruisers, 2,500cc motorcycles. You even have the Haas motorcycles with car engines in them. In 1960, I'd say the most versatile motorcycle was the naked bike. It makes sense, right? In Europe, you had towns every 5 to 10 miles. So if you're on the open road, you're not on the open road for very long before you ran into a town. So having a cafe racer or some kind of a nimble bike like that, a BSA or Norton, those made sense. In the US, we had wide open spaces. So it made sense to have a larger Harley Davidson, something with a windshield. And here we are now in 2020 with the US having, and the Japanese models as well, having the entire spectrum, as well as the European models. We went from the most versatile bike being the naked bike, and this is a Mose. The most versatile bike today is the dual sport bike. For one, it's got the largest distribution of usage. And it's not just because it can go off-road, because you can put dirt tires on a naked bike and take it off-road, but you're going to be missing some ground clearance. So even if I take away the powerful dirt capability of dual sports, I still say it's the most versatile. They're comfortable on long runs because you have the upright position. Many of the dual sports come with a small windshield, and on a 500 or 600 mile day, that windshield helps keep the wind off your chest, makes it a little easier to breathe. You're going to have less fatigue. The big reason I think the dual sport is, one, the most versatile, and two, by far the most popular amongst experienced sport tourers, is because it uses less lean angle in turns. That's right, same turn, same speed. A tall dual sport uses less lean angle than other motorcycles. Definitely less than sport bikes, less than touring bikes, less than most naked bikes. So generally speaking, that dual sport is going to use less lean angle. Why is that important for sport tourers? Because our focus is riding new twisties every day. If you're in new twisties, you don't know the road. You're figuring out as you go. You're going into this turn, maybe a little hot. You think you know where the apex is going to be, but you're really making it up as you go. So having a bike that uses less lean angle does two things for you. One, your suspension works better, right? So here's a sport bike. If this sport bike is leaned over, look how the suspension is set up. The suspension is set up to go this way, up and down like this. But when you hit a bump, the forks have to deflect a little bit like that. Now they'll go up, they'll still compress. You can think of it as a 1-inch bump the suspension has to move almost 2 inches just to make up for that bump. It's not exactly that, but I'm just making a point. The point is the suspension is deflecting. Same with the rear wheel. The swing arm is supposed to go up and down, but now it's deflecting. So you're getting more suspension from your tires. The other thing that happens is when you're leaned over this much and you have to change direction, first of all, you're not going to counter steer from here because you're very likely to lose the front end, right? You don't counter steer when you're near the margin. Counter steering is something you do upright to get the bike to lean. Once it's leaned, it turns. Turning come from your lean, and it's also coming from the wheel cocked in. This can come up as an important point in a little bit. Now, two things. Suspension works better when it's upright, and it changes direction more easily when it's upright, because when you leaned over at the margin, you're changing direction like this. Your tires are near the margin. An abrupt maneuver, you're probably going to slide out. Now, take a dual sport bike. Same turn, same speed, it's going to use less lean angle. Now my suspension is working as it's designed, right? It's going up and down more so than when I was here. And I can change direction more easily because I'm not at the margin, so I can do a little counter steering, right? Turn it in, I go this way, turn it in, I go that way from this position, then I am from this position. So that's one of the reasons why dual sport bikes tend to be so popular among sport tourers. You can go around a turn, it's blind, you don't know what's going on, you can make the adjustment. I tell you, in my days of sport touring, I've had enough situations where cars were in my lane. And I'm not talking about goat path roads. I'm always expecting them in my lane on a goat path road, but I'm talking about a legitimate road with a double yellow line, and this truck is in my lane. And I know that's happened to people before. And it is what it is. You've got to adjust. And I'd rather be on a bike that I can change direction quickly than to be on one that I'm leaned over at the margin. So back to the point. Dual sport bikes are, in my opinion, the most versatile. However, what's going on is that you have all these other great bikes that are responding to what we love, our passion, what our heart tells us, whether it's a chopper or a bobber or a cafe racer, a sport bike, all of these different cruisers. These motorcycles speak to us. Now, what's not clear to people is that every one of these designs is about compromises. Motorcycles are compromises in general. You get benefits from more rake and more trail, and you get benefits from less rake and less trail. It just depends on where you are. The simplistic way of thinking about it is a dirt bike is great on single track, very agile. It's not very good at high speeds. If you ever ridden a dirt bike above 70 or 80 miles an hour, it's a little bit skittish, right? Same thing with a motorcycle that's set up to do 200 miles per hour, super, super stable at high speed. It's not the friendliest motorcycle when you get on a gravel road or on a dirt road. So consider that agility and stability are inelastic. If you move stability up, you're robbing it from agility. If you take agility and improve that, you're robbing it from stability. So this is why the motorcycle designs are a bucket of compromises. So when you choose a motorcycle based on the style, you have to be aware of what compromises you're picking up, you're accepting, or you may end up with a motorcycle that sits in your garage and nobody wants that. Before you go looking at motorcycles, rather than going in with the 80% view of style and a 20% view of how you plan to ride it, get back to that first inkling that you had when you decided you wanted to get a motorcycle. Picture where you were, what kind of riding you were doing, who are you riding with. That's how you want to use the motorcycle. The styling should be 20%. Pick the motorcycle based on 80% how you're going to use it, because it's going to reward you. Can I take a Harley Davidson on a goat path road? That's a narrow, barely lane and a half road, kind of tight, twisty around mountains. You can't see around the turns. It's a lot of fun, but it's also so sketchy, right? I can take an Electra Glide on that road. People do it. But that's not the best place. There are better places for a Harley Davidson to spend its time. An Electra Glide, speaking of. A dual sport bike works very well on a goat path road. Sport bike, not so much. Sport bike is too stable. The steering is a little bit slow. Now you may say, what do you mean a sport bike is slow? Yeah, it's slower because it has to be super stable. I would call a dirt bike has quick, fast steering. It's very agile. It's got to be able to dance around through the single track. So again, shift it. When you buy a car, we tend to buy a car 80% style, 20% functionality or utility. When you buy a motorcycle, you want form to follow function. 80% function, how you plan to use it. You're going to be riding in the mountains. You're going to be riding on the highway, you're looking for back roads, maybe you're touring across the country, maybe you're hanging out with a group of riders. In that case, maybe you want to slant towards the kind of bikes they have so that you all like the same kinds of roads and the same sorts of destinations. So we can break this down a little bit more. So you got cruisers. You can spot them quickly. You walk into a dealership, just start looking at the angle of the forks. You see the angle of the forks there, it's more raked out. That's going to give you a nice straight line. It's going to be very easy to ride straight at slower speeds. It's going to be a little bit heavier in steering. You wouldn't want to take it on a racetrack like you would this bike. This bike is very, very good at being stable upright and is very good at being stable leaned over. You get it to lean over by counter steering hard. It gets the bike over. Now you're turning. This bike does not like spending a lot of time doing this. It's too stable. It's made for here, bam, and there, and then you start coming back up. And then of course you have the bikes with the fairings. These are touring bikes. They're going to be happiest on the highway. And then what I like in between is something like a sport touring motorcycle, which has some wind protection, but it also has some of the characteristics of a sport bike and is designed to do well on the highway and do well in the twisties. It's not going to be the best in the twisties. It's not going to be the best on the highway, but it's very functional for how you want to use it. When I lived in the Chicago area and I used to ride 500 miles to get to the Smoky Mountains, it was all about larger sport touring bikes because I had 500 miles on the highway and I'm grinding out that freeway time. And then I needed to be able to do twisties and hustle through the turns in the mountain roads for 3 or 4 days before coming back. Now I'm in California, I roll out of bed, I'm in the twisties. I don't need a heavy sport touring bike. I still like the leader bikes or 1200 cc's, but I'm okay with the naked bike. I'm okay with the bike that I can dance through the twisties. I don't need all of the wind protection. Anyway, quick primer, more to come on that. I'll look at some of the comments and respond to them and maybe later do some focus posts because there are alternatives like the bike behind me, the Triumph. This is the Triumph Scrambler XC. There's also an XE. So I'm saying X-Ray Charlie versus X-Ray Echo. The X-Ray Echo has an extra inch of travel. And essentially it's a dual sport bike in retro bike clothing. If you look at it, this bike has a 21-inch front wheel, just like your aggressive dual sports. It has the long suspension travel, very high center of gravity. Unlike most dual sports, the forks are not as steep. They're a little bit more raked out, which gives you more high-speed stability. So this actually is a very versatile bike. And if I had to say, based on geometry and paper, and I haven't spent a lot of time on it, but in my short ride on the bike, I would put it in this camp of saying it may be one of the most versatile motorcycles because they sort of resolved one of the downsides of a dual sport. Many dual sports after 100 miles an hour, they're sort of nervous feeling, whereas the sport touring bikes don't have that. The disadvantage of the sport touring bike is down low in parking lot and slightly higher speeds. They don't have that agility. This bike gives you a nice combination of both. Again, they're trying to stretch that agility and stability continuum, making it more elastic than it typically is. So give that bike a look. But the bigger point is think about how you first came to decide you wanted to ride, tap into that. And that's the kind of motorcycle category you want to move towards. And then look at the style within that category. You'll be happier and your bike will be on the road getting miles and miles instead of in the garage waiting for your next bike. Be safe out there.